There's other things in property such as inland marine. Inland marine is for something that's not tied to a specific location. Sometimes it's called a property floater. Most common example in personal lines would be jewelry. Jewelry is attached to your body. Can't really call it contents because it doesn't sit in a building long enough. If you have something that's constantly changing locations, especially if it's off-site for more than 180 days, you have to schedule it as inland marine. The other thing I always recommend on the property side is that you recommend them to do a photo or video inventory. It's a free thing that they can do for not a lot of work, but it's very helpful at the time of a claim. And I always explain that at the time of a claim, every single company will come out there and give you a list and ask you what was damaged in this claim, and they'll have to fill out the list. So by having a photo or video inventory, it's easier to jog up the memory. I had a church that had a fire, and the way that they filled out that inventory was, well, here's a burned up couch, here's a burned up crib, here's a burned up TV. It's not nearly as nice a way to go about it as having pictures stored in the cloud or an off-site location, whatever they choose. But I always recommend a photo or a video inventory. Starting on page 3 are your property extensions. You can get lost in the weeds on these. I like to stick to the highlights. I tell my prospect or customer, I'm just gonna hit the highlights. If they have questions, read through, let me know. But I'm gonna talk about the items where we have the most claims. And that tends to actually deter some of the random questions about arson reward or installed lock recalibration. A good thing to remember about property extensions is that we are extending limits from one point to the other point. These property extensions do not provide extra coverage. They are just extending the current coverage to cover other things. If you have property you want to cover that's at an address not listed on the policy, you need to schedule that address if you want the property extensions to apply. Additionally, if you only schedule $5,000 in coverage, there's only $5,000 available to extend to any of these extensions. So for example, you have pavilion across the street. It's a separate address. You want to provide coverage for this pavilion. You should schedule that pavilion for $15,000, and then if you also add contents coverage, your property extensions for both building and contents will extend to that location. So if there's also a shed on site across the street, by scheduling the pavilion, you've also created coverage through the property extensions because the pavilion coverage will now extend to cover the shed that's also across the street. So just remember, you've got buckets of coverage. Bucket meaning building or contents. If that address does not have building or contents coverage, then the property extensions cannot extend because there's nothing to extend from. Property taken off premises, there's $50,000 in coverage for up to 180 days, meaning if they have handbells, they take the handbells off-site for a concert and they get stolen out of the choir director's trunk 2 days later when they didn't take them back into the church right away, you have coverage because it was less than 180 days of being off-site and they were contents of that building. So there's an extension of $50,000 in contents coverage while it's off-site. The next item is there's newly acquired or constructed buildings or personal property. I explain this as a grace period for you to let us know when you've constructed a new building or someone left their house in a will to you guys. There's automatic coverage. You just have to let us know that you got this building. You have newly acquired or constructed buildings up to $2 million in coverage. However, if you only have $20,000 in contents coverage on the policy, there's only $20,000 in coverage that can extend over into this new area. After that, I jump to other outside objects and structures, specifically other unscheduled structures and contents. If you remember, we just covered the scheduled buildings and contents. Now, unscheduled means on-site, however, not listed on the policy. If it is off-site, you must schedule the building or contents coverage for that coverage to extend. So examples of this will be sheds, playground equipment, signs, fences, any of that stuff. It is important to look and see, sort of eye things up and say, is that more or less than $15,000? $10,000 is the basic extension. So if you see a shed, looks kind of big, not on the policy, maybe you want to schedule it because it goes above the $15,000. Or if you see an electronic signs are almost always more than $15,000, so please schedule those. If you have a $30,000 sign and they only get $15,000 in a claim, you're not going to have fun at the time of that claim. That's not a fun phone call to take. Here's the debris removal that I mentioned earlier. This is debris removal for our covered losses. So if fire burns down the building, you get an extra $25,000 in coverage, then it starts pulling away from the building limit. The next coverage I'm going to talk about is personal property of others or personal property of clergy. I explained that this is the same coverage, it's just a higher limit for the pastor. It's important to note that certain churches don't call their pastor a pastor, so please research the website and denomination and use correct terminology when referring to their pastor. But it's the same coverage. It's for anything that is owned by a person in the church but used for the church's benefit. So volunteer in the praise team leaves their guitar there, or the senior pastor has a bunch of books. This is how we extend coverage to those two items. We had a situation where a bunch of sports memorabilia was damaged. It was owned by the pastor. The pastor refused to submit the claim to his homeowner's carrier. Therefore, we couldn't pay because there was a primary policy and it had to get denied by the primary policy before we would pay since we were excess. This also means that if he didn't have a high enough limit or if he had a deductible left over, the limit on the church's policy can be used to pay that deductible or pay for what wasn't covered. Key things to remember: it's got to be used for the church's benefit. So Sally brings her iPhone to the church and it gets stolen. Well, the church didn't ask Sally to bring her iPhone there, so it's not covered. One more important thing to note here is that if they have a lot of expensive things or a lot of pastors, for example, they have a music pastor who has 10 really expensive guitars, he should have them covered by his homeowner's policy, but let's say he doesn't, and the senior pastor also has a bunch of books, and they also have an associate pastor and 3 more pastors, well, $30,000 isn't going to be enough, or whatever your property extensions included. So make sure you schedule a higher limit and you're checking what this limit is. That's it for the property coverages. If you have other questions about any of these individual items, please feel free to reach out to me or anybody else on the team. We'll get you an explanation on them.